Well, welcome to the Atheist and Christian Book Club. We are a monthly gathering of believers and skeptics, respectfully discussing important books from both perspectives. My name is James Walker. I'm co-founder of the book club. I am a Christian apologist working with Watchman Fellowship, a ministry that focuses on interfaith evangelism and outreach. We have been doing the book club for about 7 years. This is the seventh year now. 7 years now. In the seventh year, I think. And we have uh, basically alternate books. We look at a Christian book one month and an atheist book the next month. We'll be looking at a Christian book this month. And we try to have conversations that are respectful, but also get to the heart of the issues. And we try to continue to have some great books from both perspectives to be able to kind of challenge our own ideas, our own thinking, as well as being able to interact and have relationships with people on the other side of the aisle, so to speak. So, my the other co-founder with me today, not by Zoom, but right here in the room with me, is Bill Cluck. Bill is a former Christian who was atheist as he founded the club, but as of recently has switched positions to say that he does believe that there is a creator. He doesn't know for sure where Jesus is in that situation, but he is open to that idea, certainly. And I would love the opportunity to baptize my friend Bill if he makes that final step, but that's kind of where he is right now. So next month in August rather, we're going to have a guest. It'll be our time to do an atheist guest. Phil Hapler is a fellow of the Royal Astronomical Society, is a science popularizer. He is the creator of the YouTube series Before the Big Bang, which has several million views. He was previously a journalist in residence at Penn State Institute for Gravitation and the Cosmos. His astronomy images have been featured in major media outlets, including the Washington Post, the BBC, and the Guardian. He has published several several papers rather in peer-reviewed journals. He lives in London, and our current author is also from the UK. But our time, because we're scheduling with the UK and the time differences and things like we're switching things a little bit. So again, it's going to be August 6th at 1 p.m. in the afternoon. We'll be discussing his book, The Battle of the Big Bang, The New Tales of Our Cosmic Origins. So you'll if you make a note of that, and we'll get something up on both our Facebook page, Friends of the Atheist Christian Book Club, and also on our website, atheistchristianbookclub.com. And Bill, why don't you take a few minutes to kind of update us? I threw a quick update out. Where are you right now on this spiritual journey?
Well, I just found the evidence very compelling and still do. I've done some call-in shows where I've asked atheists about the Pauli exclusion principle and where the electrons inhabit certain orbits and energy levels. And they said, well, that could be just a necessity because of the wave function. So this stuff is very complex and very nuanced, but still, it just seems one thing after the other has to go right for this universe to get off the ground. Because if it's not right in the first few seconds, sorry, Dan, of the Big Bang, then it might just pull in with it become a black hole. And if it goes too fast, galaxies don't form. And it's just seems one miracle after another has to go right for this thing to work. Now, I still have, which I'm going to address, I can't wait to ask Justin about New Testament scholarship. You can't go for years studying the complexities of the and nuances of the New Testament and just, forget all that. So Justin is in the house. Just
Yes, he is.
To get in for a second.
yeah. Or not in there.
So
There he is.
So you're still kind of questioning the accuracy of the New Testament,
Of course.
or was Jesus a failed apocalyptic
Yeah, yeah.
preacher, or was he
Well,
semi-successful, maybe?
which I want to ask Justin about that. I'll start off with that question. How you doing, Justin?
I'm good, thank you. Nice to be joining
Hey,
you folks.
Justin, welcome to the club. Let me introduce you real quick. Justin Brierley is a freelance writer, speaker, and broadcaster. Has become known for creating dialogues between Christians and non-Christians. Justin is passionate about creating conversations around faith, science, theology, and culture. Through creative use of podcasts, radio, print, video, social media, he aims to showcase an intellectually compelling case for Christianity while, and this is part that makes, I think, him unique amongst apologists, while taking seriously the questions and objections of skeptics. And that's one of the things I really like about his podcast and his work. Justin has worked in radio, podcast for video, and video over 2 decades. Until April of 2023, he was the theology and apologetics editor for Premier Christian Radio and hosted Unbelievable radio show and podcast, as well as the Ask NT Write Anything podcast. And I have not ever caught one episode of that one. That I need to go back and listen to some of those. Justin was also editor of Premier Christianity magazine from 2014 to 2018, for which he continues to contribute articles. In 2023, Justin wrote the book, The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God. And his first book, Unbelievable, Why After 10 Years of Talking with Atheists, I'm Still a Christian, was published in 2017. Now, just a little side note, back at the very beginning, 2017, late 2017, early 2018, the very beginning of our Atheist and Christian Book Club, that was one of the first 4 or 5 in the first couple of books that we did. And back then we didn't have the guest on in the club. We would just interview him in advance. And I had the privilege of interviewing him. So this is kind of like a decade later update, almost decade later update to what's kind of happened since then, his latest book. And that's the one we're going to deal with this morning. We will be discussing his book published in April of this year, Why I'm Still a Christian After 2 Decades of Conversations with Skeptics and Atheists, The Reason I Believe. And as I asked him 10 years ago, was it just stubbornness alone? And he assured me it was not just the fact that he was stubborn, that he has reasons that he believes. And so, Justin, welcome back to the Atheist and Christian Book Club.
Lovely to be with you. Sorry it's been such a long, interregnum between my visits, but it's great to be with you today.
Well, we should have had you on your book right before that about the rise of Christianity. Let me see.
Well, I'm all about, I'm very much happy to take this conversation wherever it goes. The first book, as you mentioned, was the Unbelievable book. The most recent book is called Why I'm Still a Christian, but it's really a revised and updated edition of that book. So
right.
But the book that I wrote, and published a couple of years ago, is called The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God: Why New Atheism Grew Old and Secular Thinkers Are Considering Christianity Again. So, you happy to take the conversation wherever we go, on any of those sorts of topics and books.
Well, great. Well, I'm the co-founder of the book club, Christian apologist. Bill was the atheist other co-founder, and he's been with the club this whole time. We've become very good friends over the years. But Bill is no longer an atheist. And so just to update you a little bit, Justin, he is kind of in between right now. He's more than a deist. He does believe the evidence is overwhelming that there must be a creator. He's not sure how Jesus fits into that. And especially about like New Testament scholarship and historical Jesus studies and things like that. He has been definitely pouring his life into reading everything and get his hands on from both sides. And that's what our club's about. We want to get the best arguments. We want to hear the best Christian arguments. We want to hear the best atheist arguments. Helps us hopefully to become better thinkers. There's a lot of parallels between what you're doing and what we're doing, I think, in trying to encourage dialogue, understanding, and long-term relationships. What comes out of that? So I'm going to swing it to Bill and let him ask the first question. And also, Bill, if you wouldn't mind introducing.
Yeah, of course. The great Ken Daniels. Justin, thank you for coming on, and thank you for bringing us Ken Daniels, who is just an amazing atheist who's going to take my place, obviously, and who was a former missionary and has a great testimony, I guess. But anyway, Justin, I want to get right to something that's currently happening. It's a theodicy question, and we can talk about esoteric theology and nebulous stuff and just, punt it on, but this is real life stuff. Here in Texas, we had a flood at the Guadalupe River. Some young girls, 27 girls, were at a Christian camp, the Mystic Camp. They lost their lives because of this flood. So my question, and it just goes to another emotional level. Two of the girls were holding hands as they were just engulfed by the flood. Just terrible tragedy. But it directly impacts the question, does God intervene in his universe? And we know from the New Testament that God healed the blind, obviously rose people from the dead, healed sickness, and God calmed the storm. So he does have the ability to affect weather conditions and so forth. So my question to you is, how do you take this? How do you feel about this? Are you familiar with it?
Yeah. Well, I'm familiar with this very sad tragedy that has occurred in Texas. It's been in our news headlines as well on this side of the pond. In many ways, sadly, there are those similar tragedies occur probably almost every day of the week in some part of the world. We obviously feel it all the more when it's close to home, as it obviously is for you in Texas. And so my first thought is, just that, yeah, it is a tragedy. And my first thought is rarely in those circumstances when I'm with someone who has been directly affected to try and give a sort of theodicy or philosophical argument. I think the best thing you can do in that situation at a practical level is just to be there for people, to weep with them, to offer what consolation you can in the moment. But yeah, that it does raise huge questions, as these tragedies always do, about whether there is any rhyme or reason. Does this in some way disprove or lend some kind of evidence against the existence of God? And I have to say, I as a Christian apologist myself, I still get struck when things like this happen by just how sad it is, and it is a difficult thing to make sense of, is the reality. I suppose perhaps especially it's made all the more keen by the fact that, this was a Christian camp, and, you can imagine, those girls and their leaders would have prayed before they went. They would have been there, and yet this tragedy strikes them. So as I say, I hesitate to immediately start to try and offer philosophical and theological reasoning for it. But I suppose, when the time comes to look at that kind of question, I suppose in the end, I have to approach this from the wider Christian worldview I inhabit. And for me, the way that I come to terms with any kind of tragic situation, which, yes, in principle, a God who is omnibenevolent and all powerful could have intervened in, is that there is something, that there's a bigger picture to take account of. And that's the fact that we live in a world where a certain amount of freedom exists within nature, within both the physical and spiritual world, if you will. And that God, as it were, it isn't always the case that God is going to intervene in every moment when, sadly, physical situations occur where there is flooding or whatever it may be. For me, that's part of the nature of living in a fallen world, living in a world that is kind of broken in a sense at a physical level. Romans 8 talks about the fact that we live in a world where there is the groaning of creation. We live in a world that has great beauty but great brokenness, where the ways in which the tectonic plates fit together means that the earth gets renewed with important minerals and so on, for sustaining life, but when we build on the fault lines, wreaks havoc, in terms of earthquakes and that sort of thing. So I've always taken the approach that when it comes to that kind of natural disaster, natural evil, it's part and parcel of this fallen world that the Bible is very explicit that we live in, and there's no guarantee, even if we are a Christian, that we're somehow to be spared, or constantly that God will be able to intervene at every moment to spare us from the realities. Likewise, being a Christian does not stop you from all the ravages of the aging process or illness or disease or whatever it might be. And these are just factors of living in the kind of world we live in. Now, there are obviously instances and occasions when God does apparently intervene to create a miraculous situation in which somebody is brought back to life, or an illness is cured miraculously, or perhaps there are sort of miraculous circumstances that might avert the consequences of a natural disaster. But I think, sadly, those inevitably those are rare. Those are rare instances that happens, and by and large, when the natural world acts in accordance with the laws that it's kind of are built in, when there is a flood, when a river bursts its banks, and there is obviously human agency in that. If there has been mismanagement of the land or whatever it might be, it's not as though it's purely, if you like, a natural evil. There may be some agency from humans as well. But what I would say is it's part of living in the kind of world that we live in. And that, for me, goes back to a much bigger story about the way that sin has corrupted the world at a fundamental level, so that we do not live in the kind of world that we're promised one day we will see. And again, going back to Romans 8, it's that promise of a new creation, of a world that's waiting to be set free from its bondage to decay, and that God has inaugurated that process in the coming of Jesus Christ through his death and resurrection. And he calls all people who follow and trust in him to be part of his setting the world right scheme. But we live in a war zone. We live in effectively a spiritual war zone in which, very sadly, people will die. Tragedies will happen. The question is, given that is the world we live in, which side are we on? Which are we sort of living in the hope and expectancy of a God who does work in the world, despite all the awful things that still happen in it, and working together for that ultimate coming together of all things in the fullness of time, where every tear will be wiped away, death and illness will be no more, and so on? Or are we do we give up hope in a world where we will see, and do we say, well, this is just it? It is a world where terrible things happen. There is no rhyme or reason. And I suppose I as a Christian, I ultimately say I'm willing to live with the tension of the mystery of this world, rather than.
That's one of Bill's favorites.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Very thoughtful answer, Justin. Very thoughtful. Here, people ask me, I've become a theist, so I've seen the evidence for God behind this thing, the fine tuning and so forth. But Christianity still probably. And here's my problem: is I've read Dale Allison. And you've sat at the feet of the great master, Dale Allison. You realize that he says the birth narratives are fictional, the post, resurrection appearances, lots of legendary embellishment. We can trust very few things as far as the miracles go and so forth. So you're still an inerrantist and fairly conservative, pretty orthodox. Why can't you not lean on your own understanding and have faith in Dale Allison's position?
Well, honestly, I don't know. I don't claim to have read everything Dale Allison has written, and so I've had the privilege of a couple of interviews with him, and I think there are things he writes that I can broadly agree with, and there are other things where I don't go with him on them. in terms of the historical side. You say I'm an inerrantist. That's not a phrase I would use of myself, actually. I think the word inerrancy is a terribly loaded phrase and not necessarily a very helpful one, because, you know, depending on how someone defines that, there are things that I would say, you know, yes, there are things that are, in a sense, errors in the Bible, but not in any way that affects the message or the credibility of the Bible. So I'm not someone who sort of is desperate to kind of weed out every, you know, Jesus said the mustard seed is the smallest of all seeds. Oh, well, there's an error. It's, you know, you have to take things in context and sort of, you know, just be prepared to understand that people abide by the, you know, the context of their day in so many ways. Anyway, that's a slight side note. The inerrancy thing, I think, is a little bit of a red herring. Yeah, I mean, I suppose where I've landed is, you know, if I'm a disciple of anyone, it's probably someone more like N.T. Wright than Dale Allison, another very, you know, knowledgeable, esteemed Bible scholar. And the reason I think I take the N.T. Wright position on the historicity of the Gospels and the reality of the resurrection appearances and so on is because I think there is a historically credible case for it. I also think that we're meant to understand that the resurrection is a physical event. It's not only physical, it's obvious, and the kind of thing that the resurrection is at some level transcends just simply a kind of, you know, juggling trick with bones. It's it's meant, you know, we're meant, I think, to take away from the stories and the resurrection appearances that this somehow, as well as being physical, also confounds their expectations and so on. So I suppose I just I've never been convinced that we're meant to take this as, you know, purely a spiritual sort of conviction on the parts of the disciples or whatever it might be. I think there's all sorts kinds of reasons why it wouldn't make sense at a historical, cultural level for people to have started circulating these kinds of stories about a resurrected Messiah. I think that on balance, that, you know, taking seriously the claim that's there in the Gospels that this man rose from the dead is a valid thing to do on that basis. Of course, I've got more than just historical critical reasons for believing in the resurrection. I'm invested in it personally. I do believe, you know, I believe in the resurrection of Jesus for reasons more than just sort of, you know, whether I side with N.T. Wright or Dale Allison on that kind of stuff. Likewise, the birth narratives. I understand, and I've read the scholarship that calls into question whether, you know, Matthew and Luke are sort of just filling in a sort of a gap. Again, I think there are a number of things in those narratives that, for me, seem like, well, I can't. Firstly, I don't particularly buy this idea that there was a necessary, you know, that there was a that they needed a kind of origin story of that sort to kind of make the whole thing feel more credible. Mark certainly doesn't need one. John appears quite happy to sort of give obviously a theological take on that. Matthew and Luke, to the extent that they do give us, you know, an origin story, it feels like they create potentially as many problems for the Christian community as solve any problems, because it's this story about a woman who gets pregnant before she's married, and that in itself seems like an odd sort of story to invent if you're kind of in that day and age. So for me, there are aspects of the story that just for me feel like, well, why would you go about inventing this? You know, now that's not to say, you know, I fully accept that people have issues with some of the historical aspects, you know, the census, you know, all of those sorts of things. I think there are ways of reconciling that. There are some interesting things I've read about, you know, different ways of understanding the Quirinius census and everything else. But for me, I suppose until I've been given a really good reason to sort of discount these stories as historical, I'm kind of willing to give them the benefit of the doubt to some extent, rather than sort of be hypercritical and skeptical of their provenance.
let me go on to what's kind of led me, the fine-tuning arguments led me to theism. One particular thing is the
Hey, Bill,
strong.
just a second. We didn't, I don't know if we mentioned it, but we only have an hour with Justin. Tina and Fallen Ape have questions. So after you're done there, we probably
Yeah,
should
no, this last
get to
question.
question.
I realize
Okay.
that. Yeah.
Yeah. No, I just want to be on that.
So the strong nuclear force, if it's 2% stronger, you just get the periodic table, but you don't get hydrogen, which is kind of important in stars because it produces carbon and oxygen. It's 5% weaker, you don't even get the periodic table, you get hydrogen. So I've used these examples to atheists, and you have your dice example with the the 60 rolls of the dice, which I think you've been criticized for. So what my explanations seem to be like water off a duck's back to these atheists. They just don't seem to have any impact on them. What's your feel on that?
Yeah, it's hard to say, why one argument seems compelling to one person, why it was for you, obviously, Bill, and why it isn't to another. I guess you'd have to get behind the psychology of someone to know exactly why. Certainly, there are people who are really invested in this area and kind of get into the weeds of the cosmological and fine-tuning arguments. They may have certain specific objections to it from a scientific perspective. I think I think though that there is a consensus around fine-tuning that the universe does have a rather remarkable set of parameters that need to be there for life to exist. The question is there an intelligence behind the universe the best explanation for that? And obviously you can go off in lots of different directions with one of the favorite candidates being multiverse and so on as an explanation for this. Now all I would say is for some people that has been one of the most significant bits of bits of sort of hard evidence, if you will, that's made them wake up to the possibility of God. And you mentioned that dice video. Bear with me. Sorry, I just got a message coming in, which I just need to respond to from my wife. I do apologize. So where was I? Yes, there is. So, and I've seen it actually, for a lot of people, even people like Richard Dawkins and Christopher Hitchens have been willing to say, if there was an argument that might move the dial for me, it is the fine-tuning of the universe argument. And I think it's partly because it's an argument that does sort of speak, at least to some level, to their desire for a kind of very specific, hard, data-driven evidence for something that is hard to explain on a purely material level. But obviously it hasn't convinced them, and that may be because there are overriding other reasons why they may feel that God doesn't exist. So inevitably, I wouldn't expect actually anyone to be convinced of God purely on the basis of the fine-tuning of the universe. What I do think is that when you add that to a whole range of other points of data, you do start to build up what I think is quite an interesting, compelling case for God. And in the end, I don't think we'll ever, whatever sort of pieces of evidence we marshal from philosophy, history, science, or whatever, I don't think we'll ever have a kind of irrefutable, overwhelming case for God or Christianity. But what you might have is enough to say, when we put Christianity and atheist naturalism side by side and ask which of these two views of reality are best supported by the data that's available to all of us, I think there's quite a strong case that Christianity has more to offer in terms of explanatory power for the data we've got than atheist naturalism. Equally, the question we began with will be a serious contender on the other side of that. Suffering and evil is a very difficult one. So, so I'm not. Yeah, it doesn't surprise me too much that there's lots of atheists who say, "Well, it doesn't convince me," because they may have all kinds of other reasons why they feel no, it's I can't buy it still. Or maybe they're.
Well, Justin, I don't know if you've heard, but some
yeah.
atheists become atheists for emotional reasons. But anyway, that's it for me. Go ahead, guys.
So,
Why don't you introduce? Do we want to go with
Tina
Ken
had a
next,
question.
or-
Tina has a
Tina
question,
first? Okay.
and then Fallen Ape will have a question, and then Ken's third in line. So Tina, if you want to ask, go ahead.
Sure. Hi, Justin.
hi, Tina.
So I did listen to your book, the audiobook of Why I'm Still a Christian. I always appreciate that the authors read their own books. You
Thank
did a great
you.
job. One of the things that really stood out to me the most was when, sorry, headphone issues.
Sorry.
I'm going to switch the audio to my cell.
No worries.
Oh, that wasn't working either.
No?
So
Okay.
I'm going to.
We can hear you fine.
She can't hear us.
Can you hear us? That's the question.
Yeah, I can hear you. I can hear you through my phone. Hold on 1 second. I'm sorry. I thought I had this figured out.
All right.
Well, do you want to ask the question? And
Yeah, okay. I just left in the cell phone and just put it through the computer. I'm sorry. So I'm asking a question on behalf of a friend, because when I see your excellent summary of Gary Habermas's minimal facts approach, I think that is very powerful. But my friend, who is a non-Christian, often struggles with how Christians treat subjective ideas as if they were objective truths. For example, she doesn't see how the question, why is there something rather than nothing, is important, since all answers seem imaginary and culture bound. Similarly, she's confused by how Christians treat the resurrection as objective historical fact, even though historical narratives and spiritual experiences are always filtered through subjective interpretation. So how do you respond to this concern about conflating subjective belief with objective truth?
Yeah. Well, I'd love to. Yeah, it'd be really helpful to tease that out with the friend a bit more, because it rather depends on what she means by that. But it sounds like she's sort of. It sounds like that could make her skeptical about an awful lot of things, because inevitably most facts, whether they be scientific, historical, or something else, are mediated through humans, and we are, of course, subjective in the way we handle things, and even most scientists, I think, if they're forced to, will admit that even the scientific method of inquiry has elements of subjectivity to it. A scientist will hold on to a pet theory well beyond when the kind of the evidence becomes overwhelming almost against their theory, because we are human, and we inevitably have motivations that are not purely rational, reason driven. So I think the fact is you can't escape that in that sense, the subjectivity, if you will, of any method of inquiry. All we can hope to do when it comes to, say, historical inquiry, is to do our best to, put aside subjective considerations, acknowledging that we'll never do that perfectly. We're all biased. We all come with a context and a culture that we're asking these questions from. But I don't see that means that the quest for truth is futile. It's just that we have to be very aware of the way in which our subjective experience does color the way we view and ask questions. When it comes to the resurrection, then I would want to say, well, look, if we're happy to say that we can know a certain amount about ancient history, if we're happy that we can talk about the reign of the Caesars and the fall of the Roman Empire or crossing of the Rubicon, these sorts of historical events with a certain degree of sort of historical certainty, then I think we can also apply that same methodology to the events described in the New Testament and ask similar historical questions of them. And in doing so, my contention is, I'm basically on the same page as Mike Licona and Gary Habermas, that there are a certain number of widely agreed upon facts that people who are invested in that part of history agree upon. So to answer your question, that your friend's question, I'm not saying that we're immune to the way in which our subjective feelings and history and everything will cause us to come to these questions, but at the same time, I think dispassionately we can simply ask those questions of, well, what did the people at the time make of these events? What can we ascertain, trying to understand the histories that they wrote down and the things that they claim to have seen? Can we get behind, again, this is why I love N.T. Wright's research. I think he does a really good job of really understanding and trying to engage the first century Jewish mindset and that kind of thing, so that we aren't simply making false assumptions about what people believed then and the way they understood the world. We're genuinely trying to put ourselves into the shoes, sandals, if you will, of those first century people. And then saying, from that perspective, does it make sense to say that they believed that Jesus had physically risen from the dead? And I think to the best that we can do that, I think there is a good case for saying that that is what they believed at the time. We're not just inventing, sort of putting our own subjective spin on this as 21st century Christians who would like this to be true. I think there is a case for saying we've done the homework, and we've this is actually the way these people understood what was happening at the time, that against all of their theological expectations, this person Jesus, who sort of they believed was the hope for Israel and the Messiah, actually physically rose and did it, and in doing so kind of completely upended to some extent their expectations of what that Messiah would be. But they were able to, it transformed their understanding of the world they lived in and the events that sort of had led up to that point. And they went out and told this new story about a crucified and resurrected Messiah in whom God's kingdom was coming. Apologies for these very lengthy answers to these great questions, but I suppose I just want to encourage your friend to say, well, we do our best to be as critical as we can of our own subjective biases, but in the end, we would have to abandon all of science and history and education if we were somehow completely hamstrung by the fact that we do have to operate out of our subjective experience. And I just don't think that's, it's not feasible to kind of just say, well, everything's off the table because we're ultimately subjective beings in that way.
Yeah, one thing that I thought of actually was, well, can't you apply the subjectivity and objectivity to science as well? She's a science teacher and a math teacher. And I'm thinking, well, there are objective aspects to science, and then there are subjective ways in which we interpret the science.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I don't think that you can just say that the existence of subjectivity negates the ability to have good reasons to trust something is true.
Absolutely. Yeah. No, I'd agree with that. We're all, to some extent, that the way we apply science is a very subjective thing, and even some aspects of what we will allow as being science can be quite subjective. I mentioned multiverse theory earlier. There are some scientists who say that's not even science because it falls outside of the scope of being able to demonstrate something empirically. Others will say no, it is. And so you're going to have personal subjective sort of things will creep into every discipline. I'd just encourage her that there is, perhaps where she's coming from is some belief that inevitably any kind of religious claim is by its nature subjective. And I get that, because faith is a subjective experience to the person who has faith. But that doesn't mean there aren't objective historical facts that we can look at together, whether we call ourselves Christian or not, and ask what is the best explanation for this. And for me, that's perhaps the important thing, is to say there are areas which are not simply blown up by subjectivity, where we can say there's something objective for us to examine here, whether or not we believe.
But Tina, the gospel writers did have a theological axe to grind, so this is different. But we have the next question. We only got 20 minutes, guys. So what's the next question?
Ape, fallen ape. It's Richard.
Yeah, it's Richard. So,
hey, formerly Atheist.
Yes.
Hey, Justin, we talked a lot on Twitter. It's
yes,
nice talking to you in person.
nice to see you. Lovely to meet you properly.
Okay, here's a quick question. Do scholars agree that the city of Jerusalem largely remained traditional Jewish until they were sent out 40 years later? So from, say, 35 to 75, pretty much the whole city rejected the message, whether it was, 30,000 people and only 1,000 believed, or if 10,000 believed in Christianity, but a lot more than 30,000. I think scholars disagree on how many people were in Jerusalem, but it seems like they agree that the city of Jerusalem largely said no to the resurrection and held tight until they were ran out of town. Is that true?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, you're probably asking the wrong person. This is where you need an NT Wright or a Dale Allison in the hot seat. But I'm willing to go with that if that sounds like a kind of a sensible kind of summation of the historical period.
Okay, that's really all I had. I thought you might know for sure, so that's really all I have. So we can keep the clock moving, and I'll bow out.
Well, I'll hold my hands up and say you haven't invited an expert in ancient biblical history here to the conversation, so I will defer to people who know better than me what the exact makeup of and what the impact of Christianity was in Jerusalem before the fall of Jerusalem in AD 70.
Well, it's quite remarkable to think that this would have been a small Jewish sect, which probably would have died out with the James and the Jerusalem church if it hadn't been for the Apostle Paul. But I want to get to Ken Daniels, who you brought to us, Justin.
I didn't realize I'd brought Ken Daniels, but hello, Ken Daniels. Lovely to meet you.
Hello, Justin. Good to meet you too. I feel like I've known you for a long time through all of your interviews. That it's not mutual, obviously, because it's a one-way conversation. But I do appreciate your approach. I've really enjoyed listening to you out throughout the years. Probably listened to at least half of your podcast episodes.
Thank you.
Hoping that someday you'll resume that same format. I'm not sure if you have plans along those lines, but it'd be great if...
Well, as it happens, I'm currently in the process of recording a new show, which will very much take me back to my unbelievable roots of bringing Christians and non-Christians together. So
that's the best news so far in this show.
Yeah. Well, funnily enough, I've just been emailing Richard Dawkins about a possible show today. So watch this space.
Even better. Very good. So,
hey, Ken, could you take just a minute and explain how he connected us together?
Yeah. So it was 2018. I was listening to Unbelievable, and you mentioned this group, this book club in
fantastic.
Texas. I didn't know where in Texas, so I Googled it and found it's about 20 minutes down the road from where I live. So it's like,
hey, how about that?
And so
fantastic. I'm so glad to hear that.
Yeah, so I was listening to a show out of the UK, and brought me to a local club that I'm now part of. So, and by the way, I think it's more than 7 years because I think it had been running for at least a couple of years before I joined, which was in 2018. So
2017, I think.
Okay.
Either that or it may have been early 2018. I think it was late. I think it was 2017 though.
Obviously, God's providence, Ken.
So, and I listened to your book. I had to do the Audible because the text would not do justice just off the page. I had to had to listen to the
very kind
the great Justin Brierley. I appreciate your approach, and especially I respect the way that you have shifted your position on a couple of issues. The biggest one for me is internal conscious torment. The fact that you've shifted your position on that towards an annihilationism approach. So that to me puts you much closer to my camp, the way I think. That was one of the things that led me away from the faith. I think I was a missionary in Africa with Wycliffe Bible translators, and a lot of what I read in the Bible disturbed me, and especially in the Old Testament. And I think you had mentioned along the way, in addition to your position on the eternal conscious torment shifting, you had also softened your position on some of the traditional views of let's say, the Canaanite conquests and so forth, whether that was really God's intent for that to all happen. You might be able to explain that a little bit better than I can. I don't know if I'm misrepresenting you, but so all that to say, I do appreciate your willingness to flex on those positions. I don't know how much time we have, but if I could is it possible for me to quickly show my screen to explain why I remain an agnostic? One of the main reasons why I don't.
Sure, Ken. We might need to give you permission for that. I'm going to make you a co-host. Now, don't take advantage of that now. Okay.
All right.
Okay, you should be able to share your screen now.
Okay. 1 second here. So I won't drain this slide, as they say, but I just wanted to show kind of a thought experiment that has led me to where I am. And I'm trying to show my screen while seeing the rest of everybody. So there's a thought experiment that has lived in my mind for many years, and that is, and this is very important what I've bolded, temporarily bracketing aside the apparently stupendous odds against the naturalistic origin of conscious agents, that's us, that can reflect on and discuss their origins, and foregoing any prior knowledge about the world these conscious agents inhabit, which competing model, theism or naturalism, best predicts the phenomena we find in the world as humans actually inhabit, as we humans actually inhabit. So in other words, I feel very acutely all the arguments for theism. In fact, Alex O'Connor talks about one argument for theism is the number of arguments for theism. That I feel very acutely, fine tuning, contingency, how to, first cause, how did everything get started, so all of those things weigh very, very heavily in my mind in favor of theism. And I've presented this before to our group in several years ago, and I got a lot of derision from it. But it is because you can always make up these tallies in a way that weights it towards your favored position, right? But I just want to kind of illustrate what I'm getting at through a couple of these. So I'm going to skip past this first one because that requires some more explanation. But let's say if naturalism is true, despite all the odds, you would need to roll the dice a lot, right? You would have to have lots and lots and lots of rolls of the dice. So you would automatically have to have a very old universe. You would have to have a large universe with trillions of planets, maybe even a multiverse with trillions of universes. So even though those items themselves are compatible with theism, I fully acknowledge that. And I'm not saying these are arguments against theism at all. People misunderstand me when I bring this up, and they think, oh, you're saying just because the universes are old and large, that's an argument against theism. No, don't misunderstand me at all. I'm granting that that's compatible, fully compatible with theism, but it's expected or required under naturalism. So those are just two illustrations of, like, according to Bayesian theory, if you have two competing or mutually exclusive hypotheses, and you find phenomena that are predicted by one but only accommodated by the other, that the theory that predicted it it's a mark in its favor, if you know what I'm saying. So
Justin, obviously Ken has not thought about this much. So what are your thoughts on his chart?
I think it's a fascinating thing. I won't do this justice, Ken. I mean, one thing, just a very cursory look down, I do notice that a lot of the phenomenon could all be bracketed essentially under the problem of suffering, because they're kind of different manifestations of that: randomness of suffering, physical defects, parasitism, physical bodies, animal suffering.
Animal suffering for me is like the biggest one.
Yeah.
To the fall.
So I kind of, to some extent, I would almost be tempted to sort of put all of those in one category, if you like.
Right.
And then it might change the way it looks a little bit in terms of the number of phenomenon that appear to be expected on naturalism versus theism. What I would say is, a listing, you can list out a set of things. There might be that one individual phenomenon carries a different kind of weight as well. Yeah, so sure. It may be that
very unscientific.
Exactly. So it's almost like if you like extended the size of the box to the weight of that particular thing for or against,
I'm in agreement with you.
So I'm kind of, as you say, the way you kind of set these things up can make it look one way or the other. I would say, in principle, I agree. There are aspects, and as I said at the top of the conversation, the suffering we see in the natural world is arguably expected on naturalism, and is a problem for theism. It's not easy to reconcile. So to that extent, that's fine. There might be a whole set of other things. I would have to kind of go through exhaustively this list that I might want to add as phenomena that also stack up unexpected on the side of, not predicted on the side of naturalism.
Yeah, I threw in a few of those,
well.
like
And
music.
so, yeah.
Music, I would not have expected music under naturalism, but is it expected or predicted under theism? It's very well accommodated. I don't know if you would predict it, but the ability to...
Well, that's interesting. I mean, I think my temptation obviously is to say, yes, it would be expected, or it's very consonant with theism.
Yeah. And that's why I put it under fits well, but not predicted.
Yeah. Right. Okay. I suppose the bigger question it raises for me is what criteria we're using for prediction, because inevitably that to some extent is a little bit subjective as well. As to we're sort of essentially putting ourselves in the place of God and saying, well, if I was God, I would expect the universe to look like this. And there's always a danger in doing that we are effectively trying to have a cosmic perspective from our very finite perspective. So, but yeah, very interesting. Do send it to me after this meeting. I'd be interested to have a bit of a deeper look at it. And thank you for
and I think what you just said is why I put most of the things under not expected but compatible, because we can't know what God would expect.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
But it's compatible. Anything is compatible with God. If you
we have to have some epistemic humility, don't we, in terms of our ability to know what is and isn't compatible with God. But yeah.
So anyway, appreciate I took an inordinate amount of time, but I appreciate your response.
No, it's great. Really interesting little piece of way of looking at things. Thank you.
All right. Thank you.
That was good, Ken. Real good. So are we up? Is Phil up next?
We have 7 minutes. Yeah. So if Phil has a quick question.
By the way, we can stay in the room a little longer and finish this out.
Yeah, apologies. I've got a hard stop at the top of the hour.
Yeah, that's no problem.
Got to go and collect a child from a piano lesson, but happy to go right up to the end of the hour.
Yeah. So Phil, I guess, okay, go ahead.
My question is going to take a long time. And that is, Justin, would you be interested in being a guest on my podcast?
May I ask what your podcast is, Phil?
It's called The Cross to Bear, and the last name is B-A-I-R, so it's The Cross to B-A-I-R. And it's Christian apologetics. I deal with doctrinal issues. I deal with philosophical issues in Christianity. And a big focus of my ministry is helping Christians avoid becoming atheists.
Okay. I'd be delighted to come on. Just get in touch. Feel free to reach out. Daniel Ray has my email, or get in touch via my website. I'm sure we could set something up.
Sorry it took so long.
No.
Yeah, no more long questions like that, Phil. Come on. He's a time hog there.
I know.
Thank goodness.
I know.
Justin, I have a wrap-up question for you. And just to let everybody else know, I just interviewed Justin a couple of weeks ago. The podcast will be coming out on the 21st and the 28th of this month on Apologetics Profile. And Justin and I kind of talk about the state of the debate between atheists and Christians. So Justin, I thought we'd wrap up on that. A quick synopsis of this. You've been doing this for over 20 years. What's the state from your seat, UK, United States, in terms of the debate between the atheists and Christians? How is it progressing? As much as you can share or want to share in a few minutes.
Again, this is a highly subjective sort of personal view on where things stand.
Sure.
But in many ways, I think my own progression perhaps slightly reflects the way things have progressed in the sort of atheist Christian debate sphere. Because when I began the Unbelievable show, it arguably was when there was a very high number of people wanting that kind of full-on Christian atheist debate. It was it was the mid-2000s. The new atheism was on the rise. There were these best-selling anti-God books being published by Christopher Hitchens and Dawkins. We had the Atheist Bus campaign in the UK. So it felt like there was a lot of energy behind these debates, often on big public stages between the likes of William Lane Craig and Sam Harris or whoever. So there was a lot of energy for that. And I think that played out in online circles. There was a lot of energy for having those debates in Facebook groups as that came online, and YouTube channels and everywhere else. And it's not that energy is gone, but I do feel like the things have shifted quite a bit. And so, especially in the Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God book, I talk a little bit about the way that, because I think new atheism itself waned to some extent, that movement, almost as quickly as it had blown up, it sort of suffered all kinds of internal meltdowns, and the movement kind of splintered in all kinds of ways. I think that the energy then went out of the organized atheist community, if you will, to kind of continue to push that kind of very sort of strong debate kind of format. And because I started to see other characters, often secular intellectuals, coming onto the scene, people like Jordan Peterson and Tom Holland and others, who weren't necessarily Christians, but who were a lot more open to the value of Christianity. They weren't dismissing it. They weren't saying it's the root of all evil. They were saying, actually, we might be missing something by jettisoning Christian faith in the West. That inevitably led to a very different kind of conversation. By the time I left Unbelievable, we were having much more of those kinds of conversations rather than those kind of traditional God versus anti-God debates between Christians and atheists. And that's where I see the way that the debate has changed. It's become more the conversations I tend to be involved in and that seem to capture the interest most of the public are more cultural debates around the value of faith and, whether, we can make sense of the world on an atheist or Christian worldview. They don't tend to focus so much on those sort of philosophical, historical, scientific kind of issues that were the bread and butter, of my Unbelievable show for so many years. So I do sense that things have changed in that regard. I think there's more of an openness in our culture to approaching these issues in a more holistic way. I'll put it that way. So when you see Jordan Peterson, whatever you think of the man, at a personal level, when you see him filling out whole stadiums with people and he's talking about the way in which the Bible is the foundation for, the 21st century West and so on, civilization, he's evidently kind of speaking to a lot of people who seem to be interested and eager in finding a sort of an alternative story for the times we're living through. They're perhaps unhappy with, disillusioned with the kind of secular story of progress and science and reason as the way forward. I think a lot of people feel like that hasn't worked out. It's not working out. And so I think there's this openness to the value, at the very least, of the Christian story as a way of understanding who we are. And for those people who eventually kind of, if that leads people far enough, I think they then inevitably bump into some of those traditional apologetics questions about suffering and can we trust the Bible and who was Jesus. But I think that that's not where most people are beginning the conversation. They're beginning much more with a sense of what is life for? Who am I? What's the purpose of life? And I get my sense is that people don't immediately shut that down with those new atheist kinds of questions. They're kind of just more open to hearing a Christian perspective on these issues than they were, say, 20 years ago. So something shifted, and really the book and new podcast series, The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God, is sort of charting why that change has happened in our culture. And from a Christian perspective, saying perhaps we need to, actually focus a bit less on the apologetic side and a bit more on these existential questions that seem to be driving this change in our culture at the moment.
Thank you, Justin. I know you got to run. Appreciate your time. It's been awesome. I will send you the previews of our podcast that we did together so you can listen and let me know if there was anything there. But thank you so much for joining us today, man. Really appreciate it.
By the way, Justin, I looked it up and it was December 2017 when we had the first time you were the guest.
Wow.
with us, and that was the like fifth or sixth book club, I think, that we did something like that. So,
Oh,
welcome
well.
back, and we'll try to make it before 10 years from
Yeah,
now.
I was going to
We'll try
say
to
let's try and make it happen a bit
In
sooner next
fact,
time. But yeah.
raise your hand. How many would like to do the other book about the rise of Christianity? How many would like to do that if Justin's available
Hey,
for that?
well, let's book something in. I'd love to do that. Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much,
Bless you
Justin.
guys. Thank you so much, guys. Have a great rest of your conversation.
Thanks,
Take care now.
Justin.
Thank you.
And Ken, there's people asking to get a copy of that chart that you put up. I don't know if in our text, can you drop a file in there? Can you do that? Or will that work?
I don't know. I'll try.
See if that will work. If not, I tell you what, if you can't do it here, we definitely can put it in our Facebook page, Atheist and Christian Book Club Facebook page, and or Friends of Atheist and Christian Book Club,
Yeah,
and then everybody can get access to it that way.
Again, it's take it with a grain of salt. It's very subjective, and
And Terry, it's great to see you. Long time. Miss you.
I actually am late because I was at a piano lesson, and I know he said he was going to pick up a kid at a piano lesson. So I'm standing in the lobby just getting the very last part of it. So anyway, yeah, I'll watch the whole thing online. Good to see you.
Great to see you. And do you guys want to hang in and talk some more about the book without the author? You guys want to do that?
Our podcast is coming out. How many of you listen to Apologetics Profile? Know about it? That's okay if you don't. I won't be offended. 2 of you. Yes.
I better, right?
Yeah, James, I have to pull teeth to get you to listen to it. It's coming out Monday the 21st and Monday the 28th on Apologetics Profile. That's our ministries podcast. But we actually, Justin talked some about what we talked about, but that'll be an additional interesting conversation that I think adds to what we talked about today. So listen to that. It's free. But
we'll link it on the Facebook page as well
when it comes out. And Tina, I'll happy to if you shoot me an email. We could maybe do a Zoom with your friend. I'm in another atheist book club in Dallas, and so I enjoy the dialogue and have learned to listen more than speaking, because then when you listen, you learn a little bit more. For me, at least, I have that thing that I do. So I'd be happy to talk to her if you want to. And Ron, it's good to see you. Hello. Anything else? Anybody wants to email me? I have Justin's email. So if you want to stay in touch with him, I put my Watchman email, dray@watchman.org. If you want to email me for Justin's contact, I can share that.
Oh, and Ken was able to do that.
He could share his file.
I see that.
I might have refined it some more before putting it up there. Actually, and that first line item, as I mentioned, requires some explanation. Maybe if I could just say one word about that. If we as conscious agents exist naturalistically, we would expect that the odds should seem stupendously against it happening, because if there wasn't an agent to create consciousness, which is very, very sophisticated, then we would expect the odds to be strongly against it. So the only way that it could happen is if like I say, the dice were rolled, a stupendous number of times. So counterintuitively, under naturalism, we should expect naturalism to appear unlikely.
So does that help support naturalism, or is it a case against it?
It's an expectation of naturalism, but it's also an expectation of theism that you would expect naturalism to appear very unlikely. So it's a wash, I think, for both of them.
Okay, yeah, that's good. One of the things that I was wanting to do, I didn't get around to, and it is in one of the chapters, he talks about Richard Dawkins and his first original interview with him years ago. And then he mentions that, of course, Dawkins was coined the phrase meme, and help make that popular, the whole idea, which today comes across mostly in the sense of social media, what's going to be on social media memes. But he lists like the 5 kind of most common atheist memes that you find regularly on social media, and then he kind of talks about the pros and cons of each one of those memes. So that's one of the things that I didn't get to go with him on that, and we could talk about that a little bit if you guys want to, or we could just hold off on that and do it online. Any ideas?
So, Tina, what did you think of his explanation? Was that satisfactory to you? Of the
I feel
minimal
like I
facts?
have to go listen to it again to be sure I got it all, because may have been a slight bit fan struck and distracted by that. But I got that same sensation when Frank Turek was on. I had to go listen to it again to make sure I got it all. But it's I think from what I could recall off the top of my head now, it's similar to what I've already been trying to express to her, which is that if you don't, if you throw out all subjectivity, well, then you can't trust any of history. And she and I have talked about that, but essentially, I brought up George Washington, for example, and she pushed back on that even, because I think she realized where I was going with that. So she kind of she's she can be tough to understand sometimes, and I want to represent her accurately.
Well, here's the thing, Tina, is let's take Paul, for example, who's some people consider the co-founder of Christianity. Huge impact. You remember in Galatians, he goes, if anybody preaches any other gospel, even the angels, let them be accursed. So we don't get the Judaizers' point of view. We don't get James and Peter, the church in Jerusalem, who said, no, you've got to still keep these Jewish laws. We've inherited Pauline Christianity, so we just got his view. Same with Celsius. We got words against Celsius that the Christian writers, but the books aren't there. So do you see we're only getting one point of view with a big theological axe to grind? Does that make sense?
Well, I mean, we can see other sources like Josephus and others that come to bear on.
Yeah, Celsius had an axe to grind too.
Yeah, you think so?
And Tina, I think
you could say that's an argument for Christianity, because in order to be true, you would think it would have to survive. So
yeah.
There's probably millions of religious theologies and ideas that we've never heard of because they didn't have the legs to get up and make a difference. So, and maybe I think Justin may have dealt with that a little bit in the rise of Christianity. Why it had so much going against it. It's a crucified Messiah. Women were the first eyewitnesses. It's like, how does this become the largest religion in the world? And is Jesus really a failed apocalyptic prophet? But he did have a little bit of success, I guess, right?
Way to understate. But
Tina,
go ahead.
Tina, I have a question, or not a question, but a suggestion for how you could move the conversation forward with your friend. And that it's a conversation that I've had with several people over the years. And what I do is I suggest to people that everybody has a bias. We all have bias, and bias is primarily psychological. And what I suggest to people or propose to people is that it's possible to be psychologically biased, but epistemologically objective at the same time. So the fact that the disciples were psychologically biased toward the resurrection and toward the gospel doesn't mean that they don't have an objective basis for believing in those things. And what's even more important about this is that the fact that they may have objective evidence and objective basis for believing these things is the reason for their psychological bias. And sometimes people don't necessarily think about that. And because they say, well, they're trying to present objective evidence for something because they are psychologically biased in favor of it. But what people don't realize is that it could be the other way around, and I think there's evidence that it is the way around, that the objective truth of the matter was the cause of their psychological bias. So I am psychologically biased in favor of a whole lot of things, but I'm psychologically biased in favor of them because I have reason to believe them. And not only that, but if you have that psychological bias and personal belief, and you have objective reasons to believe it, then you also have a reason to spread the word. Because if you're convinced that this is true and you have evidence that can show that it's true, you're going to want the world to know about it, because this is a matter of life and death, and this is a message that the whole world needs to hear. So that may be something that might be helpful for you.
But Phil, let's take 1 Corinthians, whatever, where Paul says, 500 witnesses saw the risen Jesus, some of who are still alive. Well, that's a great evidence if it's true, but we can't depose those people. What was Jesus wearing? Where was he at? Do you see what I'm saying? It's evidence, but it's not great evidence. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I understand that. I understand that sentiment. And one of the ways that I respond to it usually is by saying that it's not necessarily that whether we can depose those people or not that matters. What matters is that Paul had the confidence to say it at the time.
And the timing too. When did he say this? It wasn't 50, 80, 90 years after the crucifixion. This was within the lifetime. He implied that they could go check, and it could be that all the readers said, "Who's he talking about? We never heard of this." But
so
why would you write that to somebody?
Yeah, that's great evidence.
Yeah, so if it wasn't true, then he wouldn't be able to say it. He wouldn't be able to get away with saying it, and he would have known that he wouldn't have been able to get away with saying something like that.
Yeah, I don't think he was writing thinking that 200 years from now this is going to be a compelling case or something.
Does that make sense? Tina, does that make sense? Can she hear us?
Yeah, I could hear. Sorry. What was the last point?
Does that make sense? I mean, that we don't have good evidence like Jesus walking on the water. We have contradictory accounts. Matthew has Jesus and Peter walking on the water. Mark only has Jesus walking on the water.
That's not contradictory.
Or let's say it's not the same. Okay. The thing, and that actually might add to the credibility that we have two different accounts. So it's evidence, but it's not evidence that we would love to have, where we'd have Josephus and hostile witnesses attesting to Jesus walking on the water. Do you see what I'm saying? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I see what you're saying. I think that Gary Habermas's approach of the minimal facts seems pretty powerful to me, because you've got these several facts that are widely agreed upon, atheists and Christians, and what's the best explanation for those? So leaving aside some of the other things like walking on water, which isn't, directly related to the resurrection account, I think those other things we can address later, right?
Hey, I had a question for Richard, if he's still there. Richard? You can unmute if you're there. It looks like you're still there. Maybe not. There he is. Hey, Richard.
Sorry.
A question for you on your question for Justin about the percent. Was it about the percentage of people in Jews in Jerusalem that accepted? Was that like, if it was a true event, you would have expected a higher percentage of Jewish converts?
Right. That's something I've been working on lately. A lot of people think that the author of Acts ramped up the numbers when he said thousands and tens of thousands of people. You know, they started with 120 and then suddenly thousands and thousands. And there are Christian scholars who say, well, that's not what happened because Jerusalem had about 30,000 people and they statistically rejected the gospel and they held tight until they were run out of town. So it can't have been tens of thousands. And then some other scholars say, well, maybe Jerusalem had a lot more than 30,000 people. And so then he could have still had 10,000 Christians, and obviously they would have been called something else. They wouldn't have been called Christians, but followers of Jesus resurrecting. So some scholars say, well, Jerusalem just had more people, but still 10,000s of followers. But
Richard, it's worse than that. You have a Billy Graham concert, for example, or who just,
right.
And you have all this support, all this bias, all these churches that get together, and you'll have 1,000 converts or whatever. We got to remember, in this time, they're going totally against the grain of the Jewish thought. This is a radically new idea. And to say that 3,000 and then 2 days later, 4,000, obviously it's legendary embellishment here, correct?
That's what I think. And I also think it shows that rational thinking and just, hey, we have this claim about a person who's risen. Let's all go to the tomb and check. Like you see in the 1980s movies, the whole town's together and they're enraged. And then somebody presents evidence, and then you see the town. Everybody in the town's like, "Oh my gosh, you're right. Oh man, I see the evidence now." It probably wasn't like that. If it was like that, then the town rejected it. The town said, "Okay, there's evidence. There's Jesus. I'm seeing him, but nope, I'm going to reject it." Which means that rational thinking wasn't in play. Or it was just a narrative that was popular with a small faction, and that faction held tight, just like flat earth people hold tight despite the evidence to the contrary. But what wasn't happening was rational thinking and just evidence-based decision making from 35 till 70. That wasn't in play.
I don't think it's controversial at all that the population of Jerusalem swelled tremendously around festivals.
Yeah.
So you're looking at times 5 or 10 or something. I mean, it's a huge amount of Judea and the greater Israel coming into the city for Passover, etc. And so, you know, that may be something else to factor into your percentages on that.
Right.
Yeah. On the day of Pentecost, there were people from all around there were people from everywhere involved. And so when it said that 3,000 people were added to that day, those were not necessarily residents of Jerusalem. Those were people who were visiting with Jerusalem, and those were people, and it actually says where they were all from. They were from here, they were from there. So yeah, that's a huge impact.
You're talking about Pentecost, right? On the day of Pentecost. Yeah, it was from every nation.
That could explain it. I'm just thinking that if he was back for 40 days, then the whole city should have been like, man, we were wrong about this guy because there he is. And that seems to not have happened for whatever reason.
So you're saying there's too many or not enough converts?
I would imagine the entire city, if they watched a guy get executed and then 3 days later, he's like, hey, what's up?
So now it seems like you're arguing there should have been more instead of less.
Right. I'm saying rationality and evidence-based thinking was not in play. Either way, either he came back and they all saw it and most people said no, or he didn't come back and the narrative just took hold. Mm-hmm. So I'm not saying it had to be more or less. Way. I'm just saying that no matter what happened, evidence-based rational thinking was not in play.
Yeah, and that sounds like everywhere, every day, right?
Right. And that's how it is in the real life. That's how it is in the real world. So I think when apologists get mad and they're like, they could have falsified it. Can't you see they could have falsified it? I'm like, okay, but rational thinking, evidence-based thinking was not in play. So for whatever reason, the city didn't do that, or they did, and it just was a narrative.
Yeah, Richard, I think you're confusing what is convincing with what is objective, and with what good evidence is not necessarily going to convince everybody. And so
if it's all about resonance. I agree. That's one of my big things from my little ministry is that it's all about resonance, whatever resonates, but that has nothing to do with what actually happened. The truth is still the truth.
But if rational thinking was not in play, that's the explanation for why people didn't believe more than it's an explanation why people did.
Right.
I think that was his point.
Yeah. I'm saying no matter what, the apologists who are like, I don't care about Jesus. I'm just following the facts. I've never met the guy. I'm just following the data. Those guys have a problem because that's not the mindset that was happening in Jerusalem. So I think they're projecting that onto Jerusalem, and it doesn't work out.
Richard, how would you know what the
Interesting.
mindset of the early Jerusalem people would be?
I don't know. I'm looking at it like they either saw the data and they all changed their minds, or they all saw the data and just refused it anyway, or they were just remained in factions and they just stayed that way. And then there was a small faction who believed in the Jesus resurrection. I don't know which of those were true. I'm starting with the fact that Christian scholars say Jerusalem largely rejected it. And then Christianity grew because of the Hellenistic, Greek, Western, outside view where you could accept Jesus but not follow the Jewish law. And that was something where Paul either led the way or he was part of it and dominated it. And that's where Christianity formed and grew. The other one died. The other one held tight until the 70s, and then Jude took the remaining.
So do you believe
Christian.
that? Do you believe that without Paul, with
Uh-huh.
his genius of, hey, you don't have
Right.
to be circumcised, you can eat
Right.
your shrimp. Without
Yes.
Paul, do you believe this thing would have probably died, like you said?
I think it would have died and maybe even been replaced by that other messianic movement that happened 100 years later. I forget that guy.
Gnosticism?
No, there was another messianic movement at
yeah.
the early second century, and even some Jewish rabbis were like, "Oh my gosh, this really is the Messiah," and that died quickly. It grew quickly and then died quickly. But I'm just saying that could have been that could be what people are talking about today had it not been for not just Paul, but that Hellenistic Western movement that Paul was a part of.
Well, since we had you as the guest, have there been any developments besides you're changing the moniker? Anything happening with you? Update?
I just want to say I appreciated that Bill changed over to some form of deism or theism, and I really I didn't know his email, but as soon as I heard that, the day I heard that, the message spread quickly. I started getting texts from all of my apologist friends like, hey, he just changed over to some form of deism or theism. And I didn't have his email. So I was like, I really want to tell him, I'm totally with you. I totally get that.
Oh, thanks.
I fully support that.
I'll get James to send it to you. Yeah.
All right. And I think I might see James in in October when I go to another Ratio Christi event with Tim Johnson.
Yeah. Here in the Metroplex. Yeah.
Yep.
Right. Well, let's get together for coffee or dinner or something if you have
I'd like
time.
that. Okay.
Well, I'm going to go ahead and shut it down then. And thank you guys so much for being part. It was a great book club. Only problem was it was only the 1 hour, but that's had a great time, and we'll see you guys next month.